Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. I'm getting us started today, and I am Barney, and I'm here with my co host, and he is.
Jacob.
And today, Jacob and I have the very, very sincere pleasure of having a guest with us, and she is Laura Frantz, and she is the author of Coming Up on 20 books, and she is an INSPI Award winner and also a Christie Award winner. And a number of her books take place in the colonial era and around that time, a little before or a little after, and take place in North America as well as Europe, and are just very inspiring and paint wonderful pictures that just quickly draw the reader in. I myself am very excited to read more books, but before then, much more excited to have a chat today with Laura and hear a lot more about how her books came about, how she comes up with her stories, and about her newest book, which is just out, which is The Indigo Heiress. So, from Jacob and I, Laura, welcome to the show.
It's a joy to join you both. Thank you.
Yeah, so we thought we would get started, and I'm sure that maybe I apologize. I'm sure maybe you've answered this question a number of times, but in my college career, I was a history major, and one of my favorite classes was about colonial America. And I remember my classmates were a little bit put off by one of our required reading texts, which was Albion Seed, which was over 1,000 pages. But
Ambitious.
yes, but went into how the different kind of main areas of colonial America were, but and looked at them, and I just loved it. And so I'm curious, how is it that you have this inspiration or this love of this era of history in North America and also in Europe, and that it led you to writing this historical fiction that you do?
Well, it started very young. I was actually age 7, and I have a vivid memory of me standing in a Kentucky library of my elementary school and looking at all the little biographies of people like Martha Washington and Pocahontas and Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. And the ones that I gravitated toward at that very early age, when I had just learned to read and was beginning to write, my first story I wrote actually at age 7 was always colonial America. My interest really drops off sharply after we achieve independence as a nation. So, in the 1780s, my fascination starts to wane. I'm not sadly interested at all in history beyond 1800, but if you rewind, I'm fascinated. So the colonial era grabbed me as a child. As I said, I wrote my first story at age 7. It was set in colonial America. It was about a girl who learned to ice skate. We had gone as a family. My family was very good at going to different historic sites in the United States. And we had just gone to Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. And so I wrote my first story based on that. So fast forward to college. I went to Denison University. I actually, the study abroad program was very popular back then. It hopefully still is. And I ended up in England, where I studied the American Revolution from the British perspective, which was very fascinating. Of course, it's very different. My years as a college student, I was immersed in 18th century literature. That became the backbone of my degree. So I, was just surrounded by 18th century voices, text, letters, diaries, never knowing that I would use that someday. And somehow I assimilated the language, which I use in my novels.
Mhm.
And I tend to tease and say I live in the 18th century. I don't know a lot of what's happening. Well, I do more now, take an interest in the world and our own political situation right now and pray about that. But I've always thought I was born in the wrong century. that I wanted to, should have been born in the 18th century. But the more I research that and the more I write novels set there, the more I realize and I'm thankful that I am not a woman born in that time period. I don't think I would have survived it. The mortality rates were very harsh. It was just very challenging to stay alive. And I'm very thankful that I just get to imagine what it was like back then. So it's a fascinating time period, and I don't foresee ever leaving it as far as a novelist. So that explains kind of a little bit about why.
As you're talking there about your passion for that era and enjoying researching a variety of subjects, I was wondering, do you have an idea for a story first and then you research that idea further? Or is it typically the other way around? As you're researching and reading, then an idea for a story emerges?
You've got it. As research is truly, I love to research almost as much as I love to write. So researching for me takes you on endless rabbit trails, and truth really is stranger than fiction. Most of my novels start with a historical figure and or a historical fact, like in
Mm.
the Ballantine Legacy, a series I uh, wrote set in my only series actually set in uh, Pennsylvania. It began with a little kernel, a little nugget of research that about apprentices, gunsmiths or blacksmiths, apprentices lived with the master, the master, the journeyman, and often was required or pushed into marrying the daughter, the master's daughter. So that began that whole series. And, it's so foreign to us now. We have achieved such independence, not only with our political freedom, but just, in our personal freedom. Can't imagine being pressured to marry the daughter of the person we work for, but that was very alive and well. And is another reason, colonial America is so fascinating. It's just like another universe almost. So if research starts, is the trigger for a lot of what I do. And I just find it is so fascinating. I could just do it all the time. I was accepted to law school and was going to become a research attorney, but that's very dry, not nearly as interesting as historical research. And I'm so thankful my life took another turn. I don't have to, get mired in legalities, and I can just let my imagination go. So
When you mentioned all of the rabbit trails and all of the interesting things that you happen upon during your research, it made me think back to the first book of yours that I read, which was Tidewater Pride, and as I was reading, I found myself like putting the book down and then looking up some of the things you mentioned.
you're a
Um,
dream reader. That is so wonderful.
right,
Isn't that the amazing thing about reading for both or enjoying literature is that it's an ongoing education for both the reader and the author, like you're saying.
yeah, I think that in my case, like we just get so pulled in to your stories that we want to find out more about what is happening during these characters' lives. And I know that I mentioned in the Tidewater Bride, I think one of the main characters that was based off of John Wolfe, you just happen to sneak in this little tidbit about his bookshelf and how of course he has it's Salvatore Fabri's book about fencing, and then I had to look it up. Who is this guy? And then, oh yes, he's the premier
Oh, I love that.
fencing instructor at that time. And I'm curious, do you have like this big giant file of these little tidbits that you like to work in as appropriate to in your books, things that like also fascinated you during your research, or how
Yes.
is it? Do you just add these as extra flavor, or
Yes to all of it. Such excellent questions. So part of that stems from I have what I call a global approach to research. Before I start writing a novel, and it's getting easier because, I'm approaching I've written quite a few novels now. So you draw from that accumulated pool of knowledge that you've studied for years. For me, the global approach to research, I just, and that's what I call it. I don't think that's a real term. I look at what's going on in the world the very year or decade that I'm writing in. Tend to zero in on the year. So what was happening politically? What was happening medically? What were the contagions raging? Were there wars going on even in other parts of the world that were impacting my hero and heroine even from a distance? What was the culinary landscape like? What were they eating? What were the new inventions? Who were the great minds of the time?
Mm.
Who was, the expert, the master in fencing? Had he written a manual? Many of these experts often left a paper trail for us to enjoy today. And so I just slip those little things into my novels to make them more believable, more realistic, and give you maybe an idea of what living in that century was like, because you would have been exposed to some of that, what was going on in the world. And I just find that fascinating, that global approach to research. It kind of fleshes a novel out and maybe enriches it, I hope.
I'm kind of wondering a little bit about the tension, or maybe you don't see it as a tension between historical accuracy and telling a compelling story. Do you feel that, generally speaking, you can marry them pretty well, or do you feel sometimes they pull you in different directions?
It's always a challenge because, I'm a 21st century woman trying to write about the colonial era, and someone has said that the past is like a foreign country, and it's just almost impossible to imagine what it was like. There is that tension there. I've actually reached dead ends in research. You need this piece of the historical puzzle and you can't find it, but you need it for the book. And a lot of the time the Lord allows me to find that and leads me to the missing piece. But sometimes I don't find it and I have to make it up. And that's the hard part, where you have to stray from history, but it keeps things exciting too. I just try to keep my 21st century or whatever voice out of it as much as I can. You'll never read a feminist heroine from me. You'll never read a novel about a woman who's not churched, because the majority of people in that time period were very, you had your deist. I believe Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and you have some of these other historical figures that were not truly Bible believing people. But George Washington was the one, our greatest founder. He was called for prayer and fasting. That's, I think, how he won the American Revolution. It was an extraordinary war. My next novel is about that. And I'm just in awe. So hopefully that answers your question in a roundabout way.
Definitely, definitely. Yes.
Yeah, and thinking about making sure that your stories are set accurately as the way that people are thinking and behaving at that time. Um, as I read through your books, and it um, kind of really brings to life for me the struggles that people were facing, morally, thinking about how to deal with relations with the Native Americans, and how to deal with slavery as it's kind of possibly gaining a hold in certain areas. And just for myself, even though we're reading, I think pretty accurately how, maybe based on letters and whatnot, how people were thinking at that time, but it makes me think about how I feel and relate with people now, and how is it when you're immersing yourself in this research? How do you kind of deal with personally with these darker issues of kind of selfish land grabbing, and the relations that the colonists had with the people who were there, or the people who are being brought there against their will? How
It is very dark. And I guess the thing that saves me from going into it too deeply is I write historical romance versus historical fiction. Historical fiction is has more of a free rein in dealing with those darker topics. My publisher reminds me, I think I'm a historical writer, but it really is a historical romance is what I'm writing. And so I have to stay true to the romance angle. The dark is there, but I don't go too deeply into it. I
Mhm.
often acknowledge it in my author note.
Mhm.
I try to be respectful. Have Cherokee heritage, as so many Southerners do. I try to be respectful of other cultures. I think the white the white man, the came and did atrocious things. We're still doing atrocious things. And, it's just human nature. It's the fleshly fallen nature. And you think we would learn from those dark deeds of the past. I think we do, but what's happening in our current world tells us that evil is still alive and well. But I can only go into that a little bit in my books,
Mhm.
as I said, because I write historical romance. I have to stay true to that. There's more sweetness and light than dark in what I write. Now, if I was just pure historical writer, I could, like I said, delve more into that. But I'm not, I have a melancholy side, and I'm glad that I don't write historical fiction and dwell on that too much, because I think that could maybe take me in a different direction. And
Mhm.
we're supposed to dwell on light and not darkness. And our books, our Christian inspirational fiction, um, is truly one of the ways God shows himself in the world through very small authors like myself. We do shine a light in somebody's life. What we're writing does matter to someone. Are we going to be, will people be reading our books 100 years from now? I don't know. That would be fascinating. I often think of that the older I get. But God is doing an amazing work in fiction, Christian fiction today. And when you look at, I remember I saw a chart not long ago of the two greatest surging things in the marketplace. It's right up there with the paranormal. You have the Christian fiction against the paranormal and all the erotica and things. I mean, they're neck and neck, literally.
Mhm.
So there, it is a spiritual battle, and it's being played out in fiction, even.
So what I'm hearing you say is that your faith plays a role in your creative process. It shapes your approach to storytelling. Is that fair to say?
Oh, beautifully said. I when I was 7, I remember kind of having a little epiphany, even at that tender age, where I knew I wasn't good at much else. I was a failure at flutophone. I remember almost crying when we had to go to that dates me, had to go do the musical instrument for music time. I was horrible at it. I was picked last for teams in PE. Nobody wanted me on their team. I was just couldn't even do a somersault. I was just not very good at anything else. I failed a lot of my math classes. But reading and writing for me was held like a heavenly magic. And I knew at age 7 that there was something extraordinary about that, and that I needed to keep going toward that. And it's a gifting. I couldn't work it up. People have asked me to teach writing classes. I would never be able to do that. I'm an instinctive writer. Books have been my teachers. I don't understand craft books about fiction. They confuse me. I can't follow them. It must require some math skill, but because I just can't follow an organized pattern of character arcs and plot points and things like that. It's beyond me. So I know that reinforces that it's a gift, that whatever I'm allowed to do on paper is God's anointing, if I can use that word. Um, for however long that I have, that I'm able to do it here on Earth. I like to think I'll graduate to heaven and I'll still be writing, but I don't know. We just can't see behind that veil or that curtain yet. But hopefully that answers a little bit of what you're after there.
Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. If I may follow up with just a second part to that question, do you have a hope for how your readers would take the themes that you write about and ponder them in relation to themselves as they read your books?
I really do. I try to make my characters as relatable and real as possible. And you know, centuries and circumstances change. Our American history changes, our world history changes, but human nature is the same. So we can, we have the same experiences. We fall in love, we have children or not. We go to, start a new job. We have all these challenges, and that's what carries a reader, allows a reader into the past and still makes it relatable to the present. It's just a fascinating process, and I'm so thankful to be a part of that. Did that is that
Yes.
the answer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, when I was little myself, I also was very curious and very drawn into the colonial era. Probably, I remember thinking, just imagine growing up in Ohio, just imagine what this place must have looked like when it was all forests, and trying to mentally transport myself back to what that would have been like. And then I think I also had someone give me a reality check about how difficult life was back then. And I like how you write that in your books to make that clear for the time of starving and whatnot. But another theme that I noticed in your books related to nature and what is specifically nature, but also kind of a pureness that we have in the new world. And I wonder, is that informed by kind of an intentional theme, or is that more of you trying to just kind of paint the setting better for us as a reader?
It's a very personal theme. I was actually raised in on the grounds of Mammoth Cave National Park for the first 5 years of my life. So it was a very unusual upbringing. My mother, she didn't work. My father was in management there. So we lived on the grounds, and it was just an idyllic existence for a little girl because I had the woods were my playground, and we were always on the river there and in the woods and identifying all these things in nature. My mother still to this day, she has Alzheimer's and she's almost 90, but her love of the natural world is still very alive in her mind and heart, and it's delightful to see. So I see as I get older and spend more time with her that she passed that on to me. My novels, it's been said, nature, the natural world is another character. And I think that's true. And I don't think it's an accident that I worked in different national parks as a young woman, and now I live at the gateway of a national park, Olympic National Park, which is incredibly beautiful. I mean, we had elk in our yard yesterday. So it's just, it's just an amazing, the Lord had a play in there. It's almost humorous. He knew I loved the natural world. That was going to be a huge part of my books. And so he's blessed me with all these incredible places to live. Like Lake Crescent is just a little bit down the road. It's a glacial lake. It's like 700 to 900 feet deep. We have the mountains in our backyard. We have the beach in our front yard, so to speak. So it's just, I guess I could not keep that out of my books. I'm writing, like you said, I love what you brought up as a child that you wondered how America would have been pristine, untouched. Daniel Boone remains my hero. As a Kentuckian, Boone is big, even though he wasn't born there. He spent a lot of time there and he loved Kentucky. But how Boone, I tend to think in reverse of what you did. If Boone was brought back today, he would be shattered by what Kentucky has become. Now, my state is beautiful, but it's nothing like Boone. He would not recognize it. He might recognize the gap where he came in, into Kentucky, because it still exists. They made a park there, it's a historic site. But I don't think he would recognize the land that he spent so much time in when he was really the first white man into that wilderness. So love that you brought that up. It's something that crosses my mind often.
We've been able to hear about how several factors have influenced your storytelling, like your faith and the natural setting where you grew up. I was wondering a little bit about your family heritage. and how that might have influenced your storytelling?
Right. It has a lot, actually, maybe more now than it did at first. So as a Kentuckian, we have a rich history with Boone coming in, and then even before that, it was just a hunting ground for many tribes. And so I'm well aware of those beginnings. I my family history, so it's kind of tumultuous. I'm probably most fascinated by George Hume, my ancestor from Scotland. He was the son of nobility and lived at Wedderburn Castle in Scotland in the Scottish Lowlands. One of my novels, The Rose and the Thistle, is about that. And I also wrote a novella called A Matter of Honor about my Humes, but I'm a direct descendant. So what happened with George is he got on the wrong side of the king back in 1715 in an incident called the Jacobite Rebellion. There were several of them. The most famous was the 45 with Bonnie Prince Charlie and Flora McDonald. But I went back to the 15 because that's where my George in my family got, like I said, on the wrong side of the law. So he fought against the king and he was taken to London. He was only 20 years old. He was taken to London and he was put in Marshalsea prison. And there he rotted for a couple of years while all the nobility that fought with him were executed. But instead of executing George, my George, they put him on a boat and transported him like they did many people to the American colonies during the 18th century. So George lands, he survives the journey, many didn't. So George lands, he's about 22, and he is a cousin of the Virginia governor at that time. So that might have kept him alive. So he begs the governor for something to do, and he becomes a surveyor, George, and he actually meets George Washington, who was about 18, and he teaches George Washington surveying and works with George so we've got George Washington and my George Hume. I keep calling him my George because I'm so proud of him. But he actually adapts, he marries, he is instrumental in founding a church. And he becomes, I don't think, he's not huge like our founding fathers, but he's on the map in Virginia, and some of his children become patriots and fight in the American Revolution. So there's a lot to draw from there. He was a successful, he made it work. The sad part is he wrote letters. Our family has letters and they're documented online of he wrote to his family, large extended family, those Humes. They lost Wedderburn Castle. They lost everything. They lost their titles and everything because of what he did and his father had done. His father died soon after young George was deported. But it's just, you can draw a lot from that. And so it's a joy to kind of honor those ancestors and learn. He was a godly man, never saw Scotland again, never saw his family again. And the sacrifices that he made were, just a drop in the bucket. All of us are, most of us come from that. Our families, our ancestors, our forefathers came here under less than ideal conditions. They managed to stay alive, or we would not be here. So, there's just, and we don't know much about it. They didn't leave a trail, except my George was somewhat well known because of his nobility, his roots, and then what he did with George Washington. That has kept his name alive. And then my people, his descendants, some of them came into Kentucky. And interestingly enough, those Humes interacted with that was my father's family, interacted with my mother's family in Kentucky. They actually knew each other 200 and 300 years ago. So is that not remarkable? That shows you how small and how names and faces traveled. And I think it's amazing, that we have actually deeds or documents of them signing their names together. They weren't married, they weren't intermarried at that time, but they just knew each other, and one of them was like an attorney, and he was overseeing a piece of property and different things. So it's truly a historical feast for this author.
Wow, that was so rich. Thank you for sharing that.
And along those lines, I I know this. Notice that some of your books tend to have characters with Scottish backgrounds, or some of the stories, take place in Scotland. So that is that is born from this connection with your family. But is it also born from some research that you did while you were in Europe, in England, in Scotland, in the area as well?
It is, you know, like I have a genealogy and it's all written out and lots of sources about my family, and you read it, but it's pretty dry. And then when you actually go to Wedderburn Castle, which they lost because of what he did in that war, or uprising, you stand on the ground where your ancestors walked and you're able to access, things there that you can't just from sitting in your office in America. And I always uh, recommend going to historical sites before you write a novel. You'll find resources there you don't find anywhere else. And it just enriches you experience wise to be able to write with a little more authority, maybe that you stood there. And it's very moving when you stand on the ground your people have stood on for centuries. There's just it's almost like a homecoming. It's a strange thing. They actually did research saying that your DNA, when you return to your roots, wherever they are, that your DNA actually there's something that happens that your body and your spirit and mind connect to that place in a special way. It's a supernatural thing. God made us to, the Bible says, he put us in places, he assigns me in places. And I think that connection is never lost. And I certainly feel it when I go home. I could easily live in Scotland. It's the most remarkable place. And I could just talk about it endlessly. And I've gone several times, never enough. But at least I can, if I'm not there in person, I'm there on the page. And that's a real gift.
And I believe, speaking of that, your latest book, The Indigo Heiress, part of the story takes place in Scotland. Is that correct?
That's correct. I need to look at the page mark. I think a third of the book is in colonial America in Virginia. I can't remember
Hmm.
at what page they sailed to Scotland. So you're in Scotland for most of the Indigo Heiress. And it was interesting because I was able to kind of marry, literally, in the story, a colonial American family to a Scottish family. Very combustible, lots of historical fireworks there. And, at a very tumultuous time period, 1774, 75, right?
Hmm.
As we were sliding into, or leaping rather, into the American Revolution, some very incendiary politics happening. And it was interesting because most of my characters are patriots because my family, they were patriots and they fought. I'm a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR. I mean, that's what I'm about. But it was interesting making my heroine and her family loyalists. They remain loyal to the king. And and that's what I had studied in England. And so it was, you know, very, I think, realistic. As far as I'll get more into this next year when my Revolutionary War novel releases, but most Americans were not for that war. We weren't all patriots back then. Most of us back then, we didn't want to fight. We just wanted to live. We were busy surviving. A war, the war was fought by a very slim few. And a lot of the loyalists fled and went back to England they were literally tarred and feathered by patriots and they had to escape. So it was, our whole assumption that we were all Americans, we were all patriotic, we were all fighting this grand, glorious war is very inaccurate. And so but like I said, that I'll save that more of that for next year. And hopefully maybe we can do this again and talk about that book. So.
We touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the faith dimension of your writing, but when you think about the legacy of your books, what would you like readers to remember most as they come away?
I think I'd like the readers to remember the faith element of my books. Publishers Weekly has called my writing spiritually subtle. I don't know what that means, except I'm writing in a time period where the church, faith was very active, 18th century. The Enlightenment was happening where you have the reason intruding, and you have, I'm writing actually a character who's an atheistic professor at the University of Edinburgh right now. So that was very much in play there. But it's wonderful to write characters whose faith played a huge part in their lives, because that was just the reality of the 18th century. Most people sadly didn't own a Bible. Um, the Anglican Church, that authority was fading because that was the English church. The Baptists were coming up. The Mennonites. You have the people like my husband's ancestry is fascinating. They were from the Swiss Alps, and just they were Moravians, and they came in and they were missionaries. So, you had all those elements involved. But the faith element, I think, for readers, if they don't remember anything else about my books, and there's, I think, 15,000 new books releasing a week now, if you can believe that. I would like them to remember the Lord maybe speaking to them through the book, shining a light. I'm always amazed when readers write, and there was actually in one of my frontier novels a couple of years ago, Texas A&M ministry leader wrote and said one of their young women had come to know Christ through one of my books, and I was just cried because only God can do that. I never set out to write that book. It was actually An Uncommon Woman, a frontier novel. And I love that book because it's mostly pulls from true West Virginia history. But never in my wildest dreams did I think that a frontier story would touch a young woman out of that university in such a way that she accepted Christ. And she credited it to that book. How did that happen? How does that even, that's a God thing. He gets full credit for it. The gift is his. How he reached her through fiction is truly amazing. You would expect it through nonfiction, maybe C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, or all these other classic books, but a small fiction novel that most people have never read reached this young woman. It gave me faith back in the power of Christian fiction, that something that we write actually matters and has an eternal component to it, significance. There's just nothing better than that. So.
That's really beautiful. Wow, that's inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. I was wondering, are there any other questions that either of you would have before we would close our time together?
Barney, you all wrote such excellent questions. We could probably talk the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah,
not going to answer anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree. Maybe just as a final comment, touching on what you mentioned about being subtly spiritual. I'm thinking of again above the Tidewater Bride, and noticing the way that you illustrated kind of how faith was working, or maybe church life was working for people in Jamestown compared with further inland, when and you can imagine, kind of the real structured, organized church that they have in Jamestown, and then this new rustic church that was led by an itinerant preacher further inland, and you can see people living and reaching and really grasping their faith in that way, and but it's not overtly written into the story. It's something that you just sense as you're reading the pages. Same as how I love how you work, kind of a scripture or here or there, that really touches the characters and that they keep with them. And I just really appreciate that about your writing, and I am so very much looking forward to reading many more of your books.
Oh, I'm so blessed. Just talking to you is just very encouraging and inspiring. I can't thank you enough.
Well, Laura, Barney, and I are so grateful. Thank you again for taking this time with us. It's been a true blessing. And we also want to thank our listeners for coming along with us on this journey. And we hope that you have gleaned something from this conversation that is inspiring for you. And just as a reminder, the latest book that Laura has written is The Indigo Heiress. So you can check that out to explore these themes further. And until next time, goodbye.
God bless you. Thank you.